Hello, listeners. This is the Risky Planner Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Risky Planner. I'm Nate.
And I'm Albert.
And today we're going to talk about all the problems plaguing your capital projects and how you can fix them. Today's episode, we're going to talk about MINExpo and all the massive advanced technology and equipment that we saw there. Aren't we, Albert?
So big. They were so big.
So big. Yeah, it was so cool. I think the most interesting was the shovels, the bulldozer shovels and the tires for me.
Yeah.
Just the fact that, it's like 2 stories tall.
Yeah, they're crazy. Like the
tires,
the shovel size and the tire. Yeah, I mean, okay. So before I get into agreeing with you, which I don't,
yes.
I would like to point out that we just went to an expo that had as one of its features a room full of the most technologically advanced mining equipment on the planet. Some of which is like over 3 stories tall. And Nate's like, the tires were cool.
Yeah, tires and the treads. The treads were cool. The treads are cool. I thought they were made of rubber, but they're all metal. Anyways, it's
build a summer home in some of those shovels too. Like
you really could. Actually, my house is probably small enough to fit in one of those shovels. I mean, square footage wise.
Yeah, I mean, mine too, probably, all things considered. Like, if you just...
I remember when I found my house, it's like close to downtown Toronto, and I was like, hey, Dad, I found this house, and he lives in this old suburb outside of Milwaukee. And he's like, oh, yeah, what's the lot size? And old suburb, remember? Like, huge frontage and whatnot. And I'm like, oh, it's 20 by, 140. And he's like, is that yards?
No, Dad.
No, Dad. No. But I was going to say, going to MINExpo and seeing those gigantic earth movers and bulldozers reminds me of growing up and going to see my dad's submarine in dry dock. Yeah. And, you would go, so these military bases, there's security, and then there's security. So you have to go to the inner base. And so you'd pass through, the outer gates. If you work at a power plant, if you work at Bruce Power, for instance, they have security outside of their facility.
Yeah, but there's always layers of security.
In.
So it's
there's always layers.
Yeah.
Same with OPG, layers of security. If you're in power generation, security is important. So, but the dry dock. So we'd go in. We'd pass through the second layer of security, and then there's a third layer of security before we get to the dry dock. And then you get into the dry dock, and the sub is it's sitting on railroad ties or these giant metal frames with railroad ties to provide the sub sort of a cushion to rest. And then the sub is 10 stories tall. I mean, it is huge.
Yeah, they're a floating city.
I was at the bottom of the dry dock, looking up at this thing, and it's just massive. And the screw is there, and and these are all top secret stuff because they don't want anybody knowing what the screw looks like, because
they don't want anybody knowing what the screw looks like except for 10-year-old Nate Habermeyer, who they would later allow to steer and command this particular submarine.
Yeah.
So security is very tight unless your name is Nate Habermeyer.
Yeah. And next week on Risky Planner is more stories about Nate and top secret,
more
et cetera,
damning
et cetera.
confessions of illegal activity by our host, Nate Habermeyer.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have the feds knocking at my door at some point. Anyways, you're absolutely right. I mean, the most technologically advanced mine equipment ever was fascinating and so big. And I mean, these are autonomous, remote, operated, massive. I mean, they're the size of houses, these are, 3,000 square foot houses. They are just enormous.
Yeah, they have more in common with an apartment complex than they do with a house, unless you've been very fortunate in life. But
true story.
I mean, we saw trucks from, I say trucks, but I'm kind of generalizing, equipment from Caterpillar, Komatsu, Liebherr, and a handful of others. You remember that battery electric truck that Liebherr brought?
Yep.
So
fully automated too.
Fully automated. Yeah. They're partnering with
Yep.
Fortescue to deploy that thing already. So
I think that was the T264.
Yeah, that's the one.
But it was fascinating to see
Yeah.
a fully automated. I mean, it is like the biggest RC.
Yeah, totally.
Right? Like
you open that up at Christmas, it's going to be a pretty exciting week. But
yeah, and I think that was the funny. Like when we were around, I think you commented that like the MINExpo really is a playground for kids, and it should cater to kids because those massive vehicles, like every kid would love to climb on it. So let's talk about MINExpo. Let's talk about some of the cool quote unquote trucks. The equipment that we saw. Caterpillar, Komatsu, Liebherr, fully automated vehicles, fully electric. What got you excited, Albert?
Well, we have a couple of mining clients, and one of the things that they have in common, and this was a common theme also running through the show, was electrification. So I was walking, there were a lot of electrification and power distribution and peak shaving and just generally energy and energy transfer related technologies on display at MINExpo. That was really cool to see. And it was kind of neat to put a, not exactly a face, but a face to the name. When you hear about electrifying mine sites, going to a trade show like this one, and that's what it is. It's a trade show. So you can really see what's on offer there, like what that's going to look like in real life once it starts to get going. Like there were, a good example of this is we mentioned Caterpillar and Komatsu and Liebherr. They have 3 different ways of electrifying their trucks, right? So Komatsu has what you might consider like a trolley system, like an overhead electrical power system with a big old rail that connects to the truck. So their trucks are what they call fuel agnostic, where they can be configured for diesel, full electric, or hybrid. They can also all be configured for autonomous and remote operations. So there's all kinds of configurability stuff that was going on at the expo as well.
I mean, it's like drones when you talk about that remote stuff. I mean, you're sitting
exactly.
in an office with a whole system surrounding you and controlling, this giant piece of machinery remotely. So it's fascinating.
It is. It's also, goes back to the theme. I've been telling everybody that where I went last week was mining Disneyland.
Yes, it really was.
Mining Disneyland is a good way to describe it for somebody who doesn't know what to expect from a mining conference, which is most people. It was pretty cool. And also we weren't there alone. We had our director of program management, Diego Abras.
Shout out to Diego.
Yeah, he may, if he's a very good boy, he may one day be a guest on this here podcast.
It's so as fascinating as all of these giant machines are, there is an inherent risk. Safety risks, there is maintenance risks, there's maintenance and upkeep, there's supply chain risks in producing these giant pieces of machinery. When we did our work with mining clients in the past and the work that we're doing now, there's a lot of discussion about risk and in the mining operation. So one might say that when you start to introduce more innovation and more technology, there's more risk of breaking down and it's not as resilient or easy to fix. So it's one of those things that's like, yeah, it's cool, but there's always risk. So I guess that brings us to our topic is, Albert, what is risk in a mining operation, even based on our current and former clients? Like what does risk in a mining operation look like?
Well, you've covered off a few interesting ways to approach this, because you mentioned kind of like a handful of risks, some of which I think would be beneficial a little bit to talk about what we mean when we talk about risk.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. because we're kind of taking it for granted that we've got a lot of project professionals in the audience, and they're listening to this and knowing exactly what they think of when they think of risk. But the truth is that there's lots of different ways to categorize it and lots of different ways to estimate for it, manage it, etc. So the three that I want to talk about are like global and systemic risk. Okay. So things that no individual enterprise has any given, responsibility for, except for the shadowy cabal of rich people that runs everything, behind the scenes. Like they're in charge of systemic risk.
Do you mean like when you say global and systemic, like what's an example of a global or systemic risk that you're referring to?
Well, the classic example, and this is the answer every risk professional is going to give right now, is the pandemic. Right. Okay. So the COVID-19 pandemic.
The black swans.
Really, yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But like even if you take that stuff out, okay, something as simple as foreign exchange impacts is also a good example of a systemic risk.
Yeah, the
because
wars and the impact on. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, and that's another good topic which we could probably spin off into its whole own episode of like how many of these are risks and how many of these are contributing factors to risks, right? Because the world is an interesting place these days, putting interesting in big fat air quotes, but with the continuation of several wars from the past few years, that has created pressure on markets and things like the grain supply chain in the case of Ukraine. It's really made and like with Russia being kind of sort of boycotted as a result of their invasion of Ukraine, the energy market in Europe looked an awful lot different. So if you were a buyer looking to get some natural gas or oil on the European continent a few years ago, you would have had Russian oil and gas to buy from at a relatively cheap price, and now you don't, right? Early on in the war, the Nord Stream pipeline was bombed, and so there's all kinds of things, and like this ultimately creates just a supply chain impact, which is kind of a great segue into the second type of risk, which is enterprise risk. Okay, so enterprise risks are those that affect a whole organization and every project or operation that it runs. Supply chain is a classic example of that. So if you are having a difficult time sourcing natural gas, then you're probably having a difficult time sourcing it for everything that you do, be it powering your facilities or whatever. Enterprise risk is, it's not like where when I think of mining, I think of project risk. Okay, let me just jump straight into that. So like project risk is like if you're running a specific project. Yeah, exactly. What is going to happen on this project that's going to, and by the way, definition of risk doesn't necessarily mean bad. Okay. A lot of folks, including myself, will lump opportunities into risks. So you've got like threats and opportunities, and those are your two kinds of risks. So, and you mentioned electrification, or we did. This is a good example of a risk that is actually both. It represents both threats and opportunities. So when you're talking about risk on mining, you're talking about all three of those things. And because mining has such deep ties into the global financial marketplace, project risks look an awful lot like enterprise and systemic risks in a mining project.
Yeah. All right. So enterprise risks. So we're talking about project risk and enterprise risk. What's another example of an enterprise risk, or maybe a story that you have about addressing an enterprise risk? What is that?
To be honest, most of the enterprise risks that I've worked, especially in regulatory, especially in mining, are regulatory in nature. And again, this is a good example of the blending between enterprise and project risk, because those show up on projects all the time. Okay, regulatory risks are huge in mining. So, especially in Canada, where a lot of the mine sites are on Indigenous lands. So the needs of the Indigenous communities need to be taken into consideration. Their leadership needs to be consulted. There are legal frameworks around that, but there's also just a moral and ethical obligation to make sure that the most direct stakeholders are consulted. So that can often take a very long time. And mining project directors and planning managers have a tendency to underestimate how much time that can take.
What are you talking about when you say time? Like how
years,
much time?
Years.
Yeah.
Like we have a client who's been sitting on a mine site that is ready to rock and roll, except that their consultation has not been completed to the satisfaction of
So no permit.
Yeah, so effectively
permit,
that's a
yeah.
permitting
Yep.
exercise. Yeah, so there's
Yep.
no ability for them to go forward. Now, this particular mine site has some, I won't mention what they are, but there's some interesting assets on the mine site that need to be managed during the transition. So this is a mining company that's now in a totally different like agribusiness space because that's what happens to be there right now. So, you could this is another good example of how enterprise and project risks kind of blend together because now the enterprise has an agribusiness to manage, and the project is nominally responsible for doing it. So you've got mining people who are managing an agribusiness, and that's a very unusual situation. But it's anyway.
What is the So with all these risks in mind and the technology we saw, like what kinds of technology innovation could be used to manage, I guess, the risks that you can control?
Well, but before I get into that, I'd like to talk about how some of these new technologies present both an opportunity and a risk, and then we can talk about how to manage them.
Okay.
So, you mentioned the Liebherr T264. In addition to being fully automatic or fully automated, it's fully electric, right? Anybody who's been in the car market in the last 5 years has noted the many, many electric vehicle options that they have. And if they live in Western Canada, like I do, they've looked around and wondered where all the charging stations are. Okay.
Right.
So it's a little different if you're building your own mine site from the ground up. You get to put the charging stations in. You get to make sure that there's enough of them, but you do have to do that. Okay. So a good, if you electrify your fleet, whether it's battery electric or something like the Komatsu solution where it's like a tram line. By the way, Caterpillar's doing it differently. They have like a little roller coaster track that sits off to the side of all the haul roads.
Yeah, they announced that at MINExpo.
They did. And
fascinating.
It's very cool.
Huge.
Yeah. It really did look like a roller coaster track too, by the way. Like speaking of this being mining Disneyland, I spoke to a couple people who were like, they really should have put like a train car on there and just run people back and forth.
Yeah, that would have been... That would have won best
in show.
But, I think the remote control dump trucks at the MMD's booth were the winners.
Hey, now that was fun.
Clear winner.
That was fun.
Yeah,
but
that was the clear winner booth.
That for you, sure, I respect your opinion. Again, I disagree with it because
you're welcome.
Yeah,
you're welcome to be wrong.
Thank you. Yeah,
that's fine.
You too, buddy. But I mentioned our pal Diego. I have a great picture of him sitting in one of those remote control rigs that we were talking about. And he was piloting a little scale model of a rope shoveler that was sitting right next to it. That was the booth to beat, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because that was real stuff. That was all actual control stuff, and Diego was basically learning how to do rope shovel, which was neat. But anyway, back to electrification. Electrification is clearly an opportunity for mine sites to conserve on diesel fuel and clean up their mine sites from an environmental perspective. There are clear benefits to not having building-sized haul trucks spewing diesel fumes into the air at all times. So there's also knock-on benefits to the mine itself, because in as much as those diesel machines have to go down deep mine shafts, which they frequently do, those fumes have to be exhausted out lest you suffocate all the workers who are doing the mining down there.
Yeah.
So if you don't have those fumes, you have less of a need for exhaust shafts and ventilation shafts. Okay. So that makes those pieces of infrastructure just a little bit smaller, cheaper, easier to afford. However, it does bring, it tacks on a threat of, for all these opportunities, I got to pay for that. So like I'm going to be really early to market for relatively unproven technologies. Now, there are electric and automated haul trucks and mining equipment out and remotely operated is pretty common actually on mine sites these days. So a lot of those like threats of being first past the post, so to speak, like first to the party, because nobody wants to be first to a party, right? Like that's a bad look.
But so electrification, great, but how do you get the electricity to the mine site? You said build your own. Like these are not, your Teslas or your Chevys. Like they're not the, cars where you plug them into the side of your wall in a supercharger overnight or whatever. These are like, they're eating up megawatts.
You want to hear a statistic about that?
Yeah. So yes, I would love to.
So we spoke to a Caterpillar rep who told us that their 798 hybrid hauler, when it's configured for full electric, so huge. Okay, it's their biggest offering right now. It just barely edges out the 797, which I've actually.
Its tires were my highlight.
We're back to the tires. Okay, got it.
Yeah. So what's the stat?
So the stat is that thing, when it's configured for full electric, uses about the same amount of power as 1,000 average Canadian homes. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. So we're not
a day or an hour.
Well, it's in terms of kilowatt hours. So.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay.
Sorry, no, not kilowatt hours. In that case, it was megawatts.
Like that rail would. I mean, if you touched it, you'd explode. There's a lot of energy. So how do you get that energy to the mining site? We're talking about really remote sites. Like you mentioned one of our clients that's ready to rock, but waiting on permits and consulting local stakeholders. But that's a remote site. What are they doing to get electricity there? Well,
building anything requires you to power it these days. I mean, there's very few things that have no electrical power demand. So the most common way to create that supply is to tie into the grid, right? So that means building new substations and hanging a bunch of poles and doing transformer work and all that stuff. Generally speaking, that's done in partnership with the local power utilities. But also, generally speaking, we're talking about a relatively lightweight amount of power demand for a site that's configured for running a bunch of diesel trucks around and diesel equipment around. Your main issue is actually fuel and getting like the fuel infrastructure put in place so that the logistics network doesn't break down and you can fuel everything every day, plus maintenance, like you've got to get spare parts and all the toys that the mechanics use and all that stuff. But on an electric site, all of a sudden that demand goes up by many, many factors of 10 in some cases. So you're talking about a huge amount of additional power draw. And that may not be something that the local grid can handle because, as you pointed out, you're talking about very remote mine sites. So one of the ways, and this didn't come up very much at MINExpo specifically, but it gets talked about online somewhat, and you hear people giving keynotes talking about it. Cogeneration is going to become a bigger deal. So we talked a little bit about that in the last episode.
Cogeneration?
Yeah, sure. So it is basically when your site generates electricity for itself to make up whatever demand is not present, or like if the grid can supply X and you need X plus Y, then you need cogeneration that's minimum Y, right? So the technologies for cogeneration mirror the technologies for power generation more generally. So in places where you have, and they're at a smaller scale than your average power station. Okay. So the cheaper and easier to implement, the more likely it will be used as a cogeneration. So right now that means that it's mostly natural gas, okay, and oil-fired plants, things like that.
Sounds like a perfect opportunity for SMRs.
Yes, absolutely. And that's where I was.
In the future.
Yep. So mine sites could definitely benefit from that. And they also need steam, which is another thing that you get from your cogeneration facility. So
yeah, I'm reading it like as an aside, you read about all of the companies that are looking for energy to meet AI needs and the amount of energy that's used by like ChatGPT and like other, AIs to train their model, to serve up queries. They're looking for and having trouble finding supply. So, mining and it's going to struggle as well.
It's
an interesting point.
It's absolutely going to struggle. And we have, all of these other industries that are competing for the same electricity. When provincial power authorities here in Canada are doing the math, they're realizing that they can't rely on just new builds to get there. They're standing up old reactors, and you've seen some of that same stuff start to happen in the U.S. Like there's talk now of restarting 3 Mile Island, which
Yep.
should scare people a lot less than it maybe does, considering that was, a jillion years ago and relatively well contained even at the time. But like the point is just like it's an old reactor that's just sitting there mothballed. If you unmothball it, that's a relative shortcut to producing some extra energy. But all of that energy is in the same marketplace where things like AI and big compute more generally and cloud computing and the internet are all competing for the same electricity as our friends in the mining world, hence cogen. And all of the, you were asking about risk earlier, all of this onboards risk. Okay, all of it does. Because, I talked earlier about one of our mining clients who is currently in the agribusiness world because they have to be. All of our mining clients are about to be in the power generation and distribution world too, because they have to be. So, a lot of that looks like peak shaving and energy savings type stuff as well. So to try to minimize how much you're spending on energy. Like Caterpillar has some cool technology that they were showing off at MINExpo, like their dynamic energy transfer system. They were showing off, battery banks and switch gears and transformers that were the size of Mack trucks that they intend to roll out to mine sites and place.
Yeah, so cool.
Very cool.
Not as big as the tires, not as big. But I want to just switch gears a little bit. So the other thing that was really cool was the remote operations, right? Because some of the clients that we talk to, they have remote mines. They have an impossible task of finding highly skilled, qualified professionals to go to these sites, and so they're having trouble staffing them. And so some of the innovation, like the autonomous, like quote unquote vehicles, because these are giant pieces of machinery, and then the remote drone type of, and it's not new, but you have to think about the risk that's involved trying to find labor and the risks that come from labor being talented individuals being on site, that the some of the advances in current technology has to be addressing that
for sure,
that labor shortage.
And like even talking about it as a shortage is interesting, because it's true that there is going to be, as mine sites ramp up, and there are more of them, like more projects being approved and going through their permitting process now than there have been in a good long time. So Canadian and American mine sites are standing up a lot of new capacity in the next 10 to 20 years, which is exciting, but it is going to create kind of it's going to put some stress on like the heavy equipment operator world.
That's right.
And you do still need a heavy equipment operator to run your fancy remote vehicle. You even need one for your fancy autonomous vehicle. So I've worked at a mine site that was in the process of moving over to, they were piloting an autonomous vehicle program, and they were already at the same time piloting a remote operations vehicle program. All of their autonomous vehicles had drivers in them. They were just sitting there waiting for the autonomous system to screw up so that they could hit the brakes or turn the wheel or whatever. And I don't know if there was, I mean, they would have kept this pretty close to the vest if there was, any failures of the autonomous system, but they still felt the need to keep those people there. But what happens when they don't feel that need anymore? So, speaking again of risk, if you put autonomous systems in trucks or whatever other equipment, and you trust those systems to operate without a human backup, then all of a sudden you've got a lot of haul truck drivers who are looking for work. So that's going to put downward pressure on salaries, and it's going to encourage fewer people to enter the workforce in that heavy equipment operations space. And if you look at what happened in, say, the military, like the U.S. military makes extensive use of drones, right?
They do.
So most of those drones are a great analog for these haul trucks that are semi-autonomous in nature. So the drones can make some decisions by themselves, but they are piloted ultimately by somebody, sitting in a trailer in Nebraska or whatever. Okay.
Yeah.
And on this mine site that I was talking about before that was experimenting with remote operation, this was 10 years ago. Okay.
What kind of remote operation were they using 10 years ago?
It was a lot like the rope shovel station that Diego was using, where they had, or there was another vendor we saw that just does remote operations. So you have like it almost looks like a flight simulator setup.
Yeah, the remote, one of the vendors that had the remote operation, the technology was the Brazilian company S4E that we saw. That was really cool. That was really cool.
And those offerings are exclusively for remote operation. And like the latency that they were claiming to be able to achieve there was measured in just a few milliseconds. Like 10 years ago, that system I was talking about that my client at the time was using was measured in seconds. It was multiple seconds. So they're literally 1,000 times faster than they used to be just a few years ago.
Okay, let's wrap it up. We're going to move to our piece of advice segment I like to end with. Albert, what's one piece of advice for companies, that we've worked with, companies that we want to work with, companies that we are working with, about risk and technology that you think you'd want to give them?
Well, I think the biggest piece of advice is to make sure that they've accounted for all of these risks when they're doing their planning, and not to paint too rosy a picture for the board, no matter what they may say. Because all of these technologies are inherently risky because they're new, right? And even the ones that are old, like remote operation, are new because they're being done in a different way, using different technologies, applied to different things. So, it's about taking a holistic view of those risks so that you can see it from the systemic marketplace all the way down into the individual impacts of individual haul truck drivers on your mine site. Taking that holistic view of risk will allow you to brainstorm a lot more risks than you might do if you just focus in on what the mine project actually has to do itself, because it's worth noting that a lot of these costs will be shared between the organization and the mining project if they're trying to, so it's easy to think about those risks as not affecting your project, but anything that affects the company is going to affect the project. So take a holistic view, make sure that all of those things are on the table, and make sure that you've got a really solid data set for measuring how much those risks might actually cost you, not just in terms of dollars, but in terms of time. We've seen a couple or three clients actually, they look like they're pretty solid on cost based on their risk profile, but their schedules are at severe risk. And for all of the reasons that we just mentioned, like the amount of time it takes to make a decision to electrify, the amount of time it takes to do the consultation, the amount of time it takes to design new technologies into existing proven ones, like putting all those electric infrastructure pieces into a mine shaft is a combination of like 17th century technology and 21st century technology. And it does take a lot of doing to integrate those ideas together, right?
Yep. Yeah, excellent. All right, thanks, Albert.
Thank you, Nate.
All right, we'll see you all next time on the Risky Planner. Thanks for listening.
Hey everybody, it's Albert here. Thanks for tuning in to the Risky Planner podcast. We hope today's conversation was informative and above all else inspires you to excellence in what you do. If you liked today's episode, don't forget to rate, subscribe, and leave a review. It helps us reach more listeners just like you. I'd also like to thank Thompson Igbo for letting us use his excellent music on our show. If you like what you hear, check him out at egbomusic.com. That's EGBO music.com. Talk at you later.